The worst decisions ever made by world leaders. Napoleon's invasion of Russia. By 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte controlled most of Europe and seemed unstoppable. So he decided to invade Russia with over 600,000 men, the largest army Europe had ever seen. He expected a quick, decisive war. Instead, the Russians refused to fight a direct battle and just kept retreating, burning their own towns and crops along the way, so Napoleon's army would find nothing to live off of. Napoleon pushed all the way to Moscow, only to find the city abandoned and set on fire. With nowhere to resupply and winter closing in, he had no choice but to retreat. The freezing temperatures, starvation, and constant attacks during the retreat destroyed his army. The invasion that was supposed to cement his dominance over Europe ended up breaking the myth of his invincibility and set the stage for his eventual downfall.
Wilhelm II's naval race. In the early 1900s, German Kaiser Wilhelm II became obsessed with building a navy that could rival Britain's. He believed a stronger fleet would earn Germany respect and influence on the world stage. Instead, it convinced Britain that Germany was a direct threat to its global power. Britain responded by building even more battleships and tightening its alliances with France and Russia. What was meant to be a show of strength instead helped split Europe into two hostile camps. When war broke out in 1914, those same alliances dragged nearly the entire continent into the conflict, ended up making World War I almost unavoidable.
Stalin's purges of the Red Army. In the late 1930s, Joseph Stalin grew paranoid that his own military leadership might turn against him, so he ordered a massive purge, executing or imprisoning thousands of officers, including most of his top generals. The goal was to secure his grip on power and remove any threat of a coup. But when Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the Red Army was left without experienced leadership at exactly the moment it needed it most. Entire armies surrendered or were wiped out in the war's opening months because there weren't enough skilled commanders left to organize a proper defense. Stalin's attempt to protect his power very nearly cost him the entire country.
Mao's Great Leap Forward. In 1958, Chinese leader Mao Zedong pushed an aggressive plan to rapidly industrialize China and boost agricultural output. Local officials were pressured to report impossible harvest numbers to please the central government, so most of them simply lied. Based on these fake reports, the government exported grain that didn't actually exist as a surplus, while ordering farms to focus on backyard steel furnaces instead of crops. The result was one of the worst famines in human history, killing tens of millions of people. Mao's vision of leapfrogging into a modern industrial power instead became one of the deadliest policy failures ever recorded. Nicholas II ignoring the warning signs. By 1917, Russian Tsar Nicholas II had been warned repeatedly that his country was on the edge of collapse. Soldiers were dying by the millions in World War I, food shortages were crippling cities, and public anger was boiling over. Advisors urged him to make reforms or step back from direct control. Nicholas dismissed the warnings, convinced that his authority came from God and couldn't be seriously challenged. Within months, strikes and protests in the capital turned into a full revolution. Nicholas was forced to abdicate, and just over a year later, he and his entire family were executed. The monarchy that had ruled Russia for 3 centuries ended because one man refused to believe it could happen to him.
Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. In 1990, Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, expecting the world to respond with nothing more than diplomatic complaints. He believed the United States wouldn't risk a war over a small Gulf state. He was wrong. The invasion triggered an international coalition led by the US, which crushed the Iraqi military and forced a retreat in a matter of weeks. The defeat severely weakened Saddam's regime, drained Iraq's resources, and led to over a decade of sanctions. The decision to grab Kuwait, meant to boost Iraq's power and wealth, instead set off a chain of events that would eventually contribute to his own downfall over a decade later. Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI's tone deafness. In the years leading up to 1789, France was drowning in debt, and ordinary people were struggling to afford basic bread, while the royal family lived in extraordinary luxury at Versailles. Advisors warned that the gap between the monarchy's spending and the public's suffering was creating dangerous resentment. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette largely continued business as usual, making only minor concessions far too late. By the time they tried to take the unrest seriously, it had already turned into a revolution. Both were eventually executed by guillotine, and the monarchy that had ruled France for centuries was gone within a few years. Khrushchev's Cuban gamble. In 1962, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev secretly placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the United States. He believed it would balance the threat of American missiles already stationed near Soviet borders and give him leverage. Instead, U.S. reconnaissance planes spotted the missile sites under construction, triggering the Cuban Missile Crisis. For 13 days, the world stood closer to nuclear war than at any other point in history. Khrushchev was eventually forced to back down and remove the missiles, gaining little and badly damaging his own credibility at home. Within 2 years, he was removed from power, partly blamed for the embarrassment of the entire crisis.
Idi Amin's expulsion of Ugandan Asians. In 1972, Ugandan dictator Idi Amin ordered the expulsion of the country's Asian minority, who controlled a large share of Uganda's businesses and industry. Amin claimed he was returning the economy to native Ugandans and seized their businesses to hand out to his supporters. Almost overnight, Uganda lost the skilled workforce that ran much of its trade, manufacturing, and commerce. Without the experience to manage the businesses, the economy collapsed within a few years. The decision meant to strengthen Uganda's economy, instead helped destroy it. Hitler's two-front war. By 1941, Adolf Hitler had already seen Germany get bogged down fighting Britain in the West when he decided to also invade the Soviet Union, opening a second front against one of the largest countries on Earth. He believed the Soviet Union would collapse within weeks. Instead, the invasion dragged on for years, draining German manpower and resources on a scale the country couldn't sustain while still fighting in the West. Stretched across two massive fronts at once, Germany's military was eventually overwhelmed from both directions. Hitler's bet that he could defeat one enemy quickly enough to focus on the other ended up being the single decision that doomed his entire war. Do you like this video? Comment down which story you want to be featured next.